Good afternoon from New York City. My name is Audrey Kitagawa, and I serve as chair of the G20 Interfaith Forum's Anti-Racism Initiative, which is hosting this webinar. The G20 Interfaith Forum views racism as a cross-cutting issue that affects all of the issues of concern to the G20 nations. Over the years, the Anti-Racism Initiative has focused on many topics involving the myriad manifestations of racism affecting people all over the world. Today, we turn our focus to the cacao trade, the delicious and highly coveted chocolate sought by Europeans drove the 19th century development of cacao plantations in some countries in Africa and Latin America. The plantations often relied on forced labor and slavery. Conditions were often harsh, and human rights violations were rampant. African countries extricated themselves from colonial rule in the mid-20th century, and the cacao plantations were taken over locally. However, some of the damaging colonial legacies and practices continued. There are additional serious consequences of the cacao industry, its impacts on the environment, including deforestation, pollution, and loss of biodiversity. Today, we have gathered a group of experts who have been involved in various aspects of the cacao industry. They will share their perspectives on the manifestation of neo-colonialism, the case of cacao, and the dark secrets of chocolate. They will discuss the ramifications of the colonial history of the cacao industry, as well as current challenges and what efforts are being made to address the human rights and sustainability issues. I am joined by Morgana Sythove, who will be co-moderating this webinar with me. The bios of each of the speakers, as well as myself and Morgana, will be placed in the chat box, so we will not be giving biographical information about our presenters while introducing them. Morgana, thank you so much for joining us. You now have the floor. Please share your introductory comments.
Thank you, Audrey. Thank you for facilitating this webinar. It's been an important step for me because we have so much to offer in this presentation. And it's clear that racism is not just a human issue. It is also an ecological issue, as the living environment is exploited from all angles. The historical background is now being conveniently forgotten and even denied. We hope to raise awareness of neo-colonialism and how it is manifesting in the cocoa and chocolate business, and what we can be done to end the exploitation of local communities. It's not enough to provide humanitarian aid, providing the bare essentials of bread, bed, and bath. We must find a way of implementing restorative healing and moving from humanitas to dignitas. Working with local people with respect and dignity, alleviating them of the dire poverty they find themselves now in. Not only are human rights at stake, but devastation caused by deforestation is also untold. According to a recent report from Mighty Earth, quote, around 75% of the world's cocoa comes from West Africa, with the Ivory Coast and Ghana the leading producers. In the last 60 years, these two countries have lost around 94% and 80% of their forests, respectively, with at least 1/3 of forest loss to make way for expanding cocoa production. Today, we will hear more about these important issues and get a glimpse of what is really going on behind every bar of chocolate. Our first speaker is Dr. Michael Ehis Odijie. You have the floor, Michael.
Thank you very much, Morgana. I originally planned to share a PowerPoint presentation, but I'm having a little issue sharing it. So I think I'll just go and speak directly without the PowerPoint presentation here. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Morgana for this, for the invitation to this needful event. So I aim to start this concise talk by exploring the relationship between colonization and natural resources in Africa. Given that this event pertains to neo-colonization, it is appropriate, I think, to start by discussing the role of natural resources in the process of colonization. Following this, I will discuss how African leaders envisioned decolonization, the antithesis of neo-colonization, in the 1960s. Subsequently, I will discuss the cocoa value chain and its alignment with the traditional colonial value chain, and then explain the implication of this from various perspectives. So to start, in understanding the relationship between European colonization and African natural resources, I'd like to begin by introducing a quotation from Walter Rodney. He said, and I quote, "Africans' greatest value to Europe at the beginning of the imperialist era was as a source of raw material," end quote. So colonization involved, among other things, the restructuring of African nations to supply raw material to the global north. Portugal, France, Britain, each intervened in their African colonies to establish this new production system. Although the way in which African countries were integrated into the global north were different, the outcome as they relate to natural resources were all the same. Ivory, rubber, gold, copper, as well as cash crops like cocoa, coffee, tea, tobacco, were the main production and export of African countries during colonial rule. At the threshold of independence, many African political elites didn't view decolonization merely as political independence, but as a transformation of this colonial economic model. So the way that natural resources were integrated into the global north. So an example of this would be Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. He said, and I quote, "States emerging from colonialism face the gigantic problem of transforming their raw material producing economies into productive units capable of bearing the superstructure of modern agriculture." So this shift away from sort of serving the global north with raw material was perceived by African political elites in the 1960s as the true meaning of independence. So how does this all relate to cocoa production and cocoa value chain? So the colonial power introduced and promoted cocoa production in West Africa during the colonial period, intending for its exportation in raw form and then processing in Europe. Although cocoa isn't a sort of direct raw material, its production depended on natural resources, for example, forest land. So if you look at the broad value chain of cocoa, African farmers are positioned at the end of the chain. They utilize vast forest land as well as labor to produce and export this raw material. So cocoa beans as raw material. So decolonization, according to somebody like Kwame Nkrumah, would be changing Africans' position in this value chain. While neo-colonization would be, on the other hand, would mean perpetuating the colonial value chain and all its exploitative elements in cocoa farming. So now let me examine some of the exploitative elements of this sort of colonial mode of production. First, the ecological costs of cocoa farming. Since forest land is a crucial production factor, the colonial regime weakened traditional land tenure, especially in Côte d'Ivoire, to facilitate cocoa farming, in order to allow cocoa farmers to occupy forests for cocoa production. So in post-1945, the French declared that land ownership would be guaranteed to whoever cultivated it. So this is a way of undermining traditional local land ownership, because this will help both cocoa and coffee production. So this led to massive influx of migrants to the southwestern forest land in Côte d'Ivoire. So this policy was continued by the Ivorian government in 1960s. The result was an increase in cocoa farming, an increase in output, but also a growing resentment between local indigenes, the real owners of the land, especially from the southwest, and migrant cocoa farmer. This resentment eventually contributed to what we know today as the Ivorian Civil War. That is to say, there's a direct link between the colonial mode of production and the sort of Ivorian Civil War of the 1990s that resulted in thousands of deaths and displacement of almost 1 million people. Moreover, the extensive deforestation in Côte d'Ivoire has led to other issues like encroachment of protected forests, as Morgana mentioned earlier. So it is important to note that the ecological costs, the cost of deforestation, and the social impact are not factored into the price of cocoa beans. This is why production and exportation of raw material is deemed unwise, because the processing end of the value chain reap most of the benefits in the cocoa value chain. So Europe reap most of the benefits, while African farmers, they bear most of the costs. So another societal cost is the rise in child trafficking in cocoa producing regions, as deforestation necessitates increase in labor inputs. The cocoa price is insufficient for farmers to pay wages. Hence, they resort to cheaper forms of labor, family labor, child labor, and in some cases, slave labor. So to conclude, I want to emphasize two things. One, I want to define decolonization as it relates to cocoa farming and neo-colonization as it relates to cocoa farming. So decolonization in this context would imply, I'm borrowing from Kwame Nkrumah, it would imply first, the renegotiation of Africans' position in the value chain by encouraging local cocoa processing companies, that is chocolate manufacturers, and then extraction of surplus from these chocolate manufacturers to pay farmers more, especially for the ecological costs. This would mean decolonization, or a complete diversification away from cocoa farming. This is according to Kwame Nkrumah. The neo-colonization in this context would signify the continuation of the colonial value chain, where African farmers continue to pay the ecological costs, and then say European and American manufacturers continue to benefit from it, while they pay the ecological costs. So this is neo-colonization. So for stakeholders, it is either you're supporting decolonization or you're supporting neo-colonization. There's nothing in between. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michael. And at this time, I'd like to call upon Sam Mawutor to please present. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much once again for the opportunity, Morgana, and then your peers. Thank you, Michael, for it's always a pleasure listening to you. Reading your articles has been quite inspiring, and it's also an honor to be speaking on the same panel with Antonie. I always enjoy listening to them. Then again, on this topic, I don't have a presentation, a PowerPoint slide, but I'm just going to tell you a lot of things that I'm uncovering in my research work. So there are 4 things I want to touch on. One is look a little bit at the history of cocoa in Ghana. And then I also want to touch on the nature of production prehistoric or before in the early stages of production and then now. And I also want to look at how or why cocoa is important. And then I also look lastly at the question of what are the solutions to addressing the cocoa problems and how do they manifest these elements of neo-colonialism. In the first place, cocoa came into Ghana somewhere in the early 1800s, so 1780 thereabout or 1880 thereabout. Let me just double check, around 1880. The records of how it came into Ghana is quite disputed, but most of us in Ghana, as we grew up, were taught one thing, that a gentleman called Tetekwashi brought cocoa from Fernando Po to Ghana. He started a seedling somewhere in southern Ghana in the Akuapem area. He nursed the seedlings, cocoa seedlings survived, and then he started distributing to farmers around that area. So the early producers of cocoa in Ghana were actually migrant farmers because in their area, cocoa wasn't doing so well. They had to go up into the Akuapem areas. Akuapem is also about a few kilometers, let's say 30, 40 kilometers out of Greater Accra. So that is where they started producing cocoa. And they did very, very well. But that was also just around the same time that Cadbury and other European chocolate manufacturers were trying to find different sources for chocolate or cocoa. Now, the fundamental problem they were trying to escape was the connection of cocoa beans or cocoa production with slavery. We'll also just step back a little bit that the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade had been recently banned. Portugal still had slave colonies in West Africa, which were producing cocoa beans under slave conditions. Cadbury and other companies in Europe were buying from them, but because of that connection of slavery to cocoa and the fact that they have been abolitionist movement people, they wanted to extricate themselves from that challenge. And lo and behold, they looked to West Africa, they looked to Ghana. Ghana by this time was already producing some small elements of cocoa, but the most important element was it was produced by free farmers, free people, people who were not under slavery, people who were not under any form of compulsion. They were producing by themselves. So European attention shifting to Ghana, Cadbury and everyone else shifting to Ghana was a means of extricating themselves from that connection to slavery. Then again, it's been local producers who have been producing this all along. And it is from the southern part of Ghana that they started pushing towards the southwest of Ghana. Then again, mostly the forested regions, that is where they have been producing most of the cocoa. And of course, historically, you'd realize that agriculture is a major driver of deforestation. And one of those important elements is cocoa. Cocoa is converting forests. Cocoa is converting either for protected areas or private lands which are forested for the purpose of growing cocoa. It's also very interesting that in the early days of colonialism, cocoa farmers were actually clashing with colonial agric officers. That's because agric officers came with different ideas of how to plant cocoa, but local people were steep in their ways. They understood the product that had been producing for, I don't know, about 30, 40 years. In 1920, Ghana became the leading producer. So they already had the expertise to produce cocoa. They had the scale to produce cocoa, and they were resistant to change. One typical issue, which was always interesting, was colonial agric officers or agric extension officers wanted farm intensification. But for farmers, it made no sense at all. Land was available. And one of the easiest way of controlling diseases among the cocoa plantation was once you have spacing, once you have other crops in between, and then or you leave the land to fallow for a little bit, all these cocoa diseases naturally were just fought away and they went away. So there was no motivation for local people to actually listen to the advice of colonial agric producers. But in the whole scheme of things, it was the colonial policy which looked at Ghana as a region for producing cocoa, which spurred on the spread of cocoa to most parts of Ghana. Policy made it possible and convenient for farmers to get a lot more from cocoa. There were a lot of exports, there were a lot of incentives being given to farmers. So that spurred on a lot of farmers to produce cocoa in most of the southwest of Ghana. Now, how was it being produced in those days? In those days, it was mostly family labor, it was mostly household labor. And it was a lot of migrants who were moving from their traditional areas to go produce cocoa. Then again, they were producing it just for the cash value. But at the same time, too, they produced cocoa in such a way that it did not inhibit their ability to produce food. So it was intercropping of cocoa with their food, which made sure that food was always abundant. There are a few times, I think in the 1920s and 1930s, when two different traditional councils tried to ban the production of cocoa for the reason of food security. But later on, they reversed it, understanding that the way of producing cocoa was consistent or did not hamper the way that they wanted to produce food. But come forward to 1947, thereabout, just before independence, of course, farmers were getting a raw deal because of the volatility of the international cocoa prices. They formed, colonial government formed the Ghana Cocoa Board, which continues to exist today and is one of, in my opinion, one of the biggest manifestations or one of the biggest relics of colonialism in Ghana's cocoa sector. The fundamental thing was to make sure that they were able to negotiate prices on behalf of farmers, but at the same time, create some surplus for the state. And that agenda still exists to today. I continue to see Cocoa Board as an institution which is clashing with farmers rather than being on the side of farmers and negotiating with farmers against, or not against, but on one side with international producers, or international buyers and chocolate companies on the other side. But unfortunately, it seems Cocoa Board wants to play a middleman role and be an arbitrator between farmers and the global community, which I think is very, very misplaced. And if we really need to look at adding value, Cocoa Board should be the institution which is actually saying, we are advocating the best for the farmers and making sure we're getting the optimum that is possible for farmers. In terms of the relevance of cocoa, it's always been the same export commodity. It's always been that important commodity which we need for our national budgets in Ghana. One of the jokes I came across was, if these colonial people had known earlier that Ghana was going to be good in producing cocoa, Ghana's name would not have been Gold Coast. Our name would have been Cocoa Coast or something, because cocoa is Ghana and Ghana is cocoa. Cocoa is way more popular and way more important than gold in those days, in the early colonial days. But so cocoa is very, very important commodity. Then again, I went to the University of Ghana. University of Ghana was founded in 1948. How did the colonial government get money to raise that university? It was through cocoa farmers' income. I mean, cocoa farmers' income have been used, or cocoa farmers' revenue have been used to build roads, hospitals, a whole range of things. But interestingly, most of these facilities are in the cities and not in the rural areas. That is why for me, in my cocoa advocacy, I see it as one of the ways I'm giving back to farmers, people who have sponsored my education, people who have contributed so much to the environment I have grown up in. I think I have a responsibility to help them in many other ways. But then let's talk about some of the current manifestations of neo-colonialism when you look at all the challenges in the cocoa sector. In the first place, when you look at how we frame the cocoa problem, a lot of literature will frame it as a problem of deforestation or an ecological problem, or as a problem of human rights, or a problem, things like that. But in my analysis, most of those problems are like top down. It is not what is the farmer really seeing. And recently, a lot of NGOs are beginning to speak with the farmer's voice, which is the fact that poverty is a big issue, has always been, but now it's much louder than we can actually afford. When you look at all the solutions that have been offered in the sector, we're talking about certification, we're talking about fair trade, we're talking about company initiatives. At its core is also to continue productivity. So it's sometimes a little bit baffling that we want to solve the problems at the farm level, want to improve the situation of the farmer. At the same time, we're interested in producing more cocoa. It's a complete contradiction. Then again, who is leading that charge? Maybe my last point I'm going to raise about the current manifestations is the fact that when it comes to the voice of the farmer, it is very, very silent, or it is completely not heard in international discussions about cocoa or international policy about cocoa. Cocoa farmers are the primary producers, and we need to make sure that their voice is heard. And the reason that they are not heard is they don't really understand what is going on. So they are from a position of disadvantage, and we need to be able to turn things around for them. That is why the work of NGOs, different government groups which are trying to speak for farmers are crucial to reversing the narrative. Maybe one last example is, recently I read an article which is saying that some companies are investing in research and technology, research and development in cocoa, but those researches are being done in universities in North America. I just can't understand it. Cocoa is produced in Ghana, cocoa is produced by farmers. All these investments which could go into those countries to improve agricultural understanding is going instead to Western universities.
Sam, thank you so much. Antonie, please, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Audrey. Many thanks, Morgana, for the invitation to be here. And especially many thanks to Michael and Sam for these excellent works. I'm quite sure that a lot of what I'm going to say would not have been part of our story if it hadn't been for the very valuable conversations I've had with both of you on this over the past few years. There's a couple of things I want to talk to you about. And the first is that there are historical injustices that resonate into the present. Halfway between the capital of Ghana, Accra, and the Ivorian border sits the slaving fort Elmina, which was one of the key places where a lot of West African human beings were enslaved and sent to the Americas over many, many centuries. This is a history that is taught in schools in Ghana, and a history that is felt, and an injustice that is felt there, which makes it extra painful that over the past 2 or 3 decades, there's been a very big conversation around modern slavery in Ghana and in West Africa, where civil society organizations, including quite a few of our members, have used the terminology of slavery quite easily, but turned that around and actually started blaming people in West Africa for this. There are historical injustices that frame the conversation, and that is being framed by people in Europe, by people in the United States, in a way where we don't feel that historical injustice in a way that it is felt in West Africa. And so when I speak with my Ghanaian friends particularly, but also with my Ivorian friends around this, it is very clear where the pain in this conversation lies. And so I think first and foremost, there's a really important lesson for us as civil society organizations in the global north to be careful in the language we use, and to be very precise in the language we use, and to listen to the voice of the South, particularly around whether or not our interventions are helpful or even harmful in the first place. There's a lot of history in there, and I hope to unpack that in the coming 6 or 7 minutes that are still left. We might have ended the official form of colonialism. And Michael rightly explained that, you know, the history of colonialism was based on the exploitation of resources in the global South for the global North. And if that is the reason for colonialism, then it could be argued that hasn't stopped at all. Because currently, all of the large chocolate and cocoa trading and companies are European or North American companies. All of their CEOs are Europeans or Americans. There is no global justice in the current trade system. It is still a transfer of value from the global South to the global North. And the decisions on which interventions to do in the last 2 decades, we've had a massive conversation around sustainability in the cocoa sector, and all of the attempts that have been thrown at the problem have been decided in the corridors of power in Europe and North America, or in the boardrooms of Europe and North America. Who decides on which interventions are going to be attempted or not already is a manifestation of colonialism, because it's the European and American companies that decide which interventions are acceptable and which aren't. I remember the first time I was in West Africa, I was speaking to a Ghanaian cocoa farmer called Yo Awusu Odijie, and he said, do you know what would be the best fertilizer? And this is important because a lot of the solutions are farmers need to grow more cocoa. We need to give them fertilizer. They need to adopt good agricultural practices. He said, do you know what would be the best fertilizer? He said, price. If you give us a good price, then we would actually grow more cocoa per hectare. You can bet on it. However, that has not been an option at the table until very recently. And the reason why it is on the table now is not because the Europeans or Americans or the big chocolate companies decided, hey, let's talk about price, but because the Ivorian and Ghanaian governments decided to start working together and to form a cartel. And they finally found the market power that they have. And they used that market power so that the voice in the South actually said, you know what we're going to talk about now? We're actually going to start talking about price. And that was finally a way to break open one of the key conversations that we need to be having. The interventions so far have always been, oh, the farmer needs to do this, the farmer needs to do that, the farmer really needs to stop doing this, the farmer X, Y, and Z. And very, very, very little was put on the plate of, and so what do the multinationals need to do differently in their exploitation of Africa? There was almost not a single answer there. Well, maybe they need to work together a little bit better. Yeah, no, guys. There's a lot more that you can do, but that's not at the table. And I think that that's a big part of the challenge. And you will see then that because we're not willing to pay the farmer a fair price, because that's not part of our palette. I just saw in the questions and answers that Isufu Isaka, who is the president for a Cocoa Farmers Association in Ghana, he mentions out of over $150 billion of gains derived from the cocoa value chain, only 3 to 5% goes to farmers. And that is discouraging. And that's exactly one of the manifestations of colonialism that we still see is that this cocoa sector is still based on the exploitation of the farmers in the first step of the supply chain. Whereas in the meantime, companies like Mars, the Mars family paid themselves more than $20 billion in dividend over the last 4 years. The Ferrero family, which is the richest family in Italy, pay themselves an annual dividend of somewhere between 600 and 700 euros per annum. That's for one family. I've done the calculations. They could give, not pay, but give every single one of their cocoa farmers a living income, run a completely functioning child labor monitoring and remediation system across their whole cocoa supply chain, and still pay themselves 160 million per annum. I mean, that's the kind of exploitative wealth that we're talking about that is frankly obscene. 3 years ago, during the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement, there was a statement that we were asked to sign as part of a group of small companies and NGOs in the cocoa sector around fighting racism and representation issues in the cocoa sector. And we signed that. And one of the points in that was, we're also going to address what our own role is in this. And we didn't sign this from a perspective of, oh, great, we're going to sign it and we're going to point our fingers at others. We decided we want to work on this. We want to actually try to figure out, how are we a part of the problem? How are our actions, and not just our actions, but how we are organized, contributing to the systemic inequality that we still see, that is still a follow-up of colonialism. And I think that we found that in at least 2, if not actually 3 major categories. And so, as you will see, I am a white man from Europe. There's nothing I can do about that. But our staff is also all based in Europe. This is not reflecting the reality of the cocoa sector. And so one of the things we're doing is we have completely restructured how we are doing our hiring process. And in fact, tomorrow, I have some job interviews for someone based in Abidjan, because we think that it's important that it's not just from here that we hold the conversation. So how we work with who we work with at a content level from ourselves is important, but also our own governance. Our board was all Europeans. Our membership were largely from the global north. And so we've started to really say, how can we work to being a much more inclusive and an open organization? That doesn't happen overnight. That doesn't go easily. And I would say that we are only very much at the beginning of this conversation of trying to figure out, how do we better, as an organization, reflect a global voice that actually truly reflects the diversity in that. That's on the inside, but also how do our analyses of what is wrong in the cocoa sector, how does that reflect colonialism? And how can we actually start challenging those structures? So that goes down to the very key basis of what do you think is normal? How do you think the world works right now? And is the way the world works right now the way the world should work? And that you're actually willing to challenge some of your key assumptions around these issues. For us, we really are still at the beginning of a journey. And I don't feel that we are anywhere close to finishing the journey yet, but at least we have started the journey, and we really need to have people around us that help also show us and correct us where we're wrong. And so we're getting more and more Southern membership in Cote d'Ivoire and in Ghana. We're looking at how does that strengthen our internal work. Now, that there's also other parts of the world that also grow cocoa that we also need to look at, particularly in Latin America. But that's work going forward. Now, I'd like to close with the fact that it's not all bad news. And I think that there's two very major developments that also give me hope around the work on decolonization and racism in the cocoa sector. And the first is this collaboration between Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, where we actually see the governments of producing nations being able to stand up and to start creating a countervailing power to the Northern dominance. Now, that is going not particularly well, but also not particularly badly. I think that with any new paradigm shift, you're going to have to give it time and you're going to have to calibrate it. And I'm very excited to see how this Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana Cocoa Initiative is working. And we're also very excited to support this collaboration going forward. But what makes me even more excited is the fact that we're also seeing civil society and farmer-based organizations in the two major cocoa producing nations, Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, starting to work together, to come together and coalesce in Ghana, and the Ghanaian Civil Society and Cocoa Platform, in Cote d'Ivoire and the Plateforme Ivoirienne de Cacao Durable. And both of those two organizations are actually able to hold their own governments accountable, because it's not up to Western NGOs to tell the producer governments what they are doing right and what they are doing wrong. That would also be a manifestation of neo-colonialism. But what we can do is we can come alongside and be allies to our friends and our allies and our partners in Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana that hold their own governments accountable, because that clearly is the right and democratic way forward. And so for us, seeing the power of the Southern producer nations starting to be heard at the global level, but also seeing the internal countervailing powers within those producer countries starting to work effectively to challenge and to hold their governments accountable, for me, are very positive ways forward. And for us, therefore, their places to take a step back from the microphone, but to actually see how can we provide a platform for others to speak loudly so that their voices are heard. That's our role, but we still are stumbling and we're still failing, and we're definitely not leading the way there, but at least we're trying to find our way there, so to speak. And conversations with Sam and Michael and many others in this have been very formative for us on that. And to us, we cannot change the cocoa sector within the current structures. We need to see fundamental structural changes in the system. And one of those fundamental structural changes in the system is to say, let's hear the voice of the South. Let's put them at a co-equal level, and let's take it seriously, because that's the only way forward.
Yes, our next presenter should have been Lars, of course, but unfortunately he's not been able to make it. And Audrey, I think you said that we have a recording prepared for Lars's presentation.
Yes, could we please play the video?
It all began as you can see in the documentary, that we were stumbling around on the cacao farms to try to set up this wild idea to a business. So it all began. Very first beginning was to get a good technical supply chain. The idea was, of course, is to upscale and to involve as many as possible farmers that can earn extra income. And so the first big challenge was the technical development of the supply chain, finding the right partners. One thing that is really important is to see, I'm a journalist. My work was to see what companies claim and what is the truth. Most important thing for us was in the beginning, okay, we set up a supply chain. Technical is a challenge, but we overcome it. Market, okay, we overcome it, we do it, and we have to make claims to get a good marketing. Can we back these claims in any time? So an important challenge is the impact validation and the impact communications. Okay, how much extra money do farmers really get for this use, and can we measure it all the time? Well, that was good, but then what happens with this money? What's the real impact we have? And that's an important thing to measure as well. So, for example, we researched here what was a big demand from the farmers is when they have extra money to make extra money with extra money. That's the effect you want to have. That's the golden spot you want to have. How can we go to that effect is to see, okay, what do farmers need to get extra money? And a lot of answers there were that an important thing for farmers is to invest in their farms itself. It's not always easy to invest or to look for the good facilities there. So we're going to build hubs that can help the farmers to use their extra money to make extra money more efficiently. Because what we saw after a year, for example, was a woman, she used her extra money to grow a pig farm. And in this pig farm generated more extra money. You saw a lot of solar panels in the village, in one village. So they didn't have electricity. They do have electricity now, which generates more welfare and business as well. And these are all very important things for us, but because we mustn't forget, and I want to really underscore this, we mustn't forget here that we working in the cacao business. A lot of parties have sustainability programs and there are premiums, but as you could see in my documentary as well, poverty is still very severe in Ghana, also Ivory Coast, amongst the cacao farmers. Having this really tangible thing as a soft drink made from cocoa juice opens up a lot of discussions, for example, with the industry as well. We being invited a lot in industry. We say we want to see if we can make parties to build local juice lines, for example, for the farmers, and that's what we think it's important to look at such opportunities. But we mustn't forget that even 30% extra income per kg of beans, even if that would be for all the beans of a farmer, then he is still, most of the farmers then still are below the poverty line. You can't do things at yourself. I think you have the responsibility when you do a thing. It's a show. Of course, you have to set up business and it has to work. And my business case has to be feasible as well to be a sustainable company to the future. But I think you have to always, when you do such things, you have the responsibility to also let your product or your intervention or whatsoever be a showcase to push other interventions as well. I'm talking about poverty line, of course, and I'm talking about living below poverty line, of course. And sometimes that's hard because when you get to know, like for instance, a farmer community in Ghana, at first you are and that's always the thing in my head. You are the white man coming in Africa to do a good project. and then be the white savior there. That's always is a thing in my mind, and but also in discussions in the company, is who are we as Kumasi to do this? Why isn't there a Ghanaian company that does this and gonna find internal markets in Africa for the cacao juice? And because I found this discussion very interesting, and I think that the neo-colonialism is about such topics, of course, as well. And I'll give you an example. I got a call last year. Kumasi was in a year ago, so a Dutch Ghanaian guy. I was calling me, hey Lars, I heard of you, heard of the brand Kumasi. Can I come to talk to you? I said, yeah, of course, come. Curious what you have to say. And we had a really good conversation. But in the end, he was saying, okay, what I'm coming for here is, Lars, he says, my family is from Kumasi. And you, as a white guy here, and a Dutch guy, is using this name Kumasi for your brand. That's cultural appropriation. So he asked me, can you change the brand name? I thought it was a very interesting question, because I'm always playing with this concept in my head. But it was interesting in the way that I was thinking, okay, but for me, and I wanted to think openly, but for me it was, okay, no, I'm not gonna do this. I'm doing Kumasi because I know I'm doing it, because I think this is important to do, and I help people. But this word I help people is at the same time it's for me it's aching as well. So I think my intention is good, and that's why I'm not going to change the name, our brand name Kumasi, the city of Ehis, to something else. And that's because I believe now in my intention. But that's also a problem, because you can also argue, yeah, Lars, you can have that intention, but it grieves him. And that's the question all the time. Who are we, or who am I to do things? Who are you to do things? I think when you can create movements, and a lot of companies, organizations, people, and especially Ghanaian people as well, or Ivorian people as well, have to think of things that can change, things that can move people, and things that can go to the how you call it, the dignity of the people themselves, to say, hey, we are here, and this is the things. These are the things we do. We are cacao growers, but we also selling juice, and we want to have a good price for it. And then, yeah, it's a kind of emancipation of both sides. So emancipation of Ghanaian people who standing up more for themselves, and farmers as well. But on the other side, even more emancipation of making them being able to stand up for themselves, and that has to do with world markets, with prices we pay for goods we get there, for luxury goods we get there. It's not only cacao, of course, but it's all these industries next together, and it has to do rethinking of world market trade. I will be really happy to answer them or to have discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that video, Lars. We're sorry that you can't be with us this afternoon, but we appreciated your comments. Now we're going to open the floor to questions from the audience. And we have seen some of the questions come in, and most of them have been answered. There is a comment from someone in the audience who wanted us to just note that he said, I think decolonialization is not only in West Africa, cocoa, but the entire African continent in regards to land resources, gold, diamond, cobalt, causing displacement and death by the South. And I think, Michael, you did address that. And the question from the audience, what are the main contributions that the education sector, both in the global South, here cocoa producer countries, and the global North, could provide in the discussed context, especially tertiary education institutions? Who on our panel would like to answer that question? Yes, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I can answer. Just off the top of my head, I can think of in the global South, research and development. I think research is really important because most of the research conducted in the global North has to do with what stakeholders in the global North want to know. So that's what they fund. That's the type of questions that they ask. So I think research in the global South would be really, really interesting because if a Ghanaian university is conducting a research, it will have to ask questions that are very, very relevant to the local context. So I think research and development, entrepreneurial and business skills, policy advocacy, even technical training. I'm talking of the global South now. Then the global North, say awareness and advocacy. I think some chocolate consumers in the global North don't properly understand some of the problems that are involved in the value chain. So I think awareness, advocacy, collaborative research. I think researchers from the global North, in my view, should collaborate more with the global South, especially people on the ground, to actually know what is going on. So capacity building, policy influence, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Michael. There is any other panelists would like to answer that question? Okay, if not, there is, I'm sorry, Sam, go ahead, Sam.
Yes, let me give it a go. As an international student based in a Western university, one of the biggest challenges I have seen, not a challenge, but the reality is any topic related to Africa, it's very, very limited. Let me rephrase. You have very limited conversations about Africa in the subjects that we take. So I'm doing research on cocoa in Ghana, West Africa broadly, and I have to do unrelated courses just to be able to find some theory and some connections to what I'm studying. Exactly as Michael said, the interest here in the North is the things that the North want to see and questions that they want to answer. But I see one of the challenges, one of the things I have tried to do with my advisor is to keep raising the point that we don't have enough content on African studies. In my classes that I get the opportunity to be guest lecturers, I raise the issues. These are the realities with commodity production. Take cocoa, just interchange it with any other commodity, and the underlying challenges will still be the same. In the South, what do we need to do? Then again, for me, I always want to start with the farmer, that we need strong farmer awareness. We need people who have experienced farming, living with farmers, being in the university, doing the kinds of research which are relevant. I completed university with colleagues who were studying agriculture, who had no experience in the cocoa sector. So the kinds of research that they did had very little applicability to improve the farmer's lot. And for me, these are things that I now know. If I knew this 10, 15 years ago when I was doing my undergraduate, then it means my program and approach will be different. So it starts with a very different orientation we need to help with farmers. And I think now farmers, people who are coming from cocoa farming areas entering the university, who are part of the conversation about living income, understanding the farmer's income, will go to university with specific questions in mind, and that will help them raise relevant questions which you can solve at their local level. So yes, let's find good questions which are relevant to Southern people and let it answer the questions that farmers would want. So those are important. Collaboration to really, really help.
Thank you so much, Sam. And there's a comment from Marita. Unfortunately, it seems to be addressed to Lars, who's not present to answer it. So unless anyone on the panel would like to address this, since it goes to the aspect of intentionality, I think perhaps not. So we will go on to the next question unless any of the panelists would like to address this question, which has to do with the impact of intention when asked to change the name of Kumasi drinks. She probably is referring to. So let's go on to the next question. How does this discussion fit into the larger Africa trade outfit, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement? Who would like to answer this question? Michael?
Yeah, I'm actually doing some research on the African Continental Free Trade area. I think it fits in so many ways. There's a research recently, I think by, I'm not sure if it's World Bank, that showed, because what the AFCFTA, what it intends to do is to create a sort of free trade, between African countries. A reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers to improve intra-Africa trade. So I think one of the effects of that, would be to promote regional value chains within the African continent. So there are chocolate producers in South Africa, in East Africa, in North Africa. Some of these chocolate producers, they don't source from Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana. So, but with a reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers, it will be cheaper for, say, a chocolate producer in South Africa to source directly from Ghana or directly from Cote d'Ivoire. So in the process of doing that, I think the trade flow or the trade connection between West Africa and Europe and America, I think would maybe break down a little. That is to say, we'd have more regional trade or continental trade within the cocoa value chain. So instead of just one global value chain, you would have a now regional value chain that is linking farmers and chocolate producers in other regions in Africa. So in a way, AFCFTA could actually change the type of conversation that we are having. But I don't know if the AFCFTA would succeed, because African countries, we have this history of negotiating and signing trade agreements, and at the same time, we don't implement them. So there are so many problems with implementation. But if it gets implemented, yes, the AFCFTA could help to change the type of conversations that we are having.
So thank you so much. Let's go on to the next question from our audience. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Sam.
So then again, I think one of the fundamental things Michael mentioned earlier is, do we really need to produce cocoa? Do we really need to? I mean, Africa, we don't consume so much chocolate. And is this a commodity that we want to be trading internally? Maybe I have a bit more unrealistic, more radical point that let's eat what we produce and produce what we eat. Let's sell across the African continent what we produce. And then let's buy from the African continent what we need. Then again, West Africa is producing about 60, 70% and above. Everything is shipped to Europe. We've been talking about value addition too. And the point is there is a lot of capital flight in value addition. Cote d'Ivoire is currently one of the world leading processors or grinders of cocoa. What value is it bringing them? There's a lot of capital flight. So for me, within Africa, I agree with Michael, let us try and turn the cocoa into a certain commodity that we can consume within the continent, create that need here. I didn't grow up eating a lot of chocolate. I didn't grow up drinking a lot of chocolate. I don't think that is going to change so much. I don't know how many farmers are going to pick up chocolate and that habit across Africa. So to create that demand of chocolate, of cocoa or chocolate in Africa, for me, if the AFTA can do that, then it means we sell regionally, it reduces a lot of cost in export. That will be great, but that is more of an ideal. But I don't know, realistically, I don't know, grow more demand in Africa, that will help.
If I can add to that, Sam, I actually think that this is where we need to challenge our assumptions of how the world is and how the world should be, right? And Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana are two massive agricultural powerhouse countries, and they import net the food that Ghanaians and Cote d'Ivoirians need to eat. It's bizarre that these two major agricultural countries are not food sovereign. And the reason for that, to a large extent, is because in the 1970s and 80s, IMF and the World Bank came to Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire and were willing to reduce debts in return for transforming their economy into a Western economy based on cash crop exporting so that they would then have foreign currency. Now, part of these debts that they were having to be jubileed from were actually debts that were incurred upon decolonization. When Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire became free, there were actually massive debt repayment negotiations that were done, and in many different West African countries, where these where the countries, in return for the freedom, promised to pay the colonizing countries a lot of money in reparations for lost income. I mean, just the bizarre concept of that is already, it just baffles me. Is like, we'll just come in, we'll run your country for 100 years, we'll rape and pillage and exploit and destroy, and when we leave, you pay us money for leaving. It's just a bizarre way how that worked. Those debts, as well as quite a lot of other debts incurred in the 2-3 decades after that, led to these restructurings in the 1970s and 80s, which has caused these countries to become cash crop exporting countries. I think part of the challenge is actually not to get all of Africa to eat more cocoa, but to get better and more holistic rural development plans where there's actually a vision for what do we want agriculture and the services sector in the rural areas of all the major cocoa producing areas. How do we actually want it to serve the people that live there, in creating the services and in creating the food and the markets that are necessary for the people there, not for them to grow cocoa for the whole world and get a lot of Africans to consume cocoa. I actually think there's a lot of other stuff that you could do with your time and with your land that might be a lot better for there. But I think because we're so stuck in this mindset of this is what we're growing, so how can we find a bigger, better market for this? Maybe we actually need to challenge those assumptions sometimes and say, why are we growing cocoa in the first place? Aren't there better things that we can do that better serve our region?
Thank you so much to our panelists for your answers. And we'll move to the next question. Who are the beneficiaries of cocoa? Is it the global South, elites in global North, or the farmers, indigenous people? And what can be done? Who would like to answer that question? Go ahead, Michael.
Who are the beneficiaries of cocoa? Okay. Yeah, it's definitely not the global South, because I mean, in Cote d'Ivoire, cocoa is the main agent of deforestation. The country, if you look at the forests, the level of forest in Cote d'Ivoire in say 1960 compared to now, it's unbelievable. The price of cocoa is not even enough for livelihood, much less paying for the ecological costs or the ecological damage. Africans don't really consume that much cocoa, so we don't really benefit. We benefit very little. So the main beneficiaries, I think, are in the global North. Chocolate manufacturers, they are, in my view, the main beneficiaries, and also the consumers in the global North. I think the government, just to be truthful, the government of Cote d'Ivoire, the ruling elite in Cote d'Ivoire and also Ghana, they benefit a lot from cocoa. I'll give an example of Kwame Nkrumah. So Kwame Nkrumah experienced a military coup in early 1966. So in 1965, the price of cocoa was so low that it was difficult for the government to extract enough surplus for the Ghanaian government to survive. So there's a link between the reduction in the price of cocoa and the military coup in Ghana in 1966. So cocoa has been used by the ruling elite in both Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana to guarantee their own political survival. The first president, the first leader in Cote d'Ivoire, I think, stayed in power for over 30 years. He was a cocoa farmer. He was the biggest cocoa farmer in West Africa even. So I think the leaders, the political leaders have benefited. Then global norms benefited, but the average African, we haven't really benefited from cocoa production at all. I think we are paying a huge price. We are paying a very huge ecological price. And the ecological cost of producing cocoa is unbelievable and is not factored into the price of cocoa. The deforestation, the child labor, child slavery, child trafficking, and the rest. So, just to summarize, the main beneficiaries are the political elites in West Africa and the manufacturing, the chocolate producing companies in the West, at the expense of farmers and at the expense of cocoa producing communities.
Thank you so much. And our next question, why does it matter that most people leading the decolonization in Ghana's cocoa, for example, are global North companies or actors? Who would like to take that question? Go ahead, Sam.
Yeah, then again, it's a little bit strange. I don't know how I'll need some clarification to say that the decolonization is led by Westerners. Then again, I will disagree a little bit with that. But let's come to the reality that in Ghana, the conversation is usually not about the size of the cocoa chocolate economy. We are usually talking about the farmer's interest, the bread and butter issues, because that is the reality. And I think in the last couple of years, Antonie mentioned the civil society coalitions, which are coming up. They are not only interested in talking about the farmer situation, they're also looking broadly at the entire chocolate supply. Where can we find more value for the farmer? How can we ensure that there is greater equity in? Obviously, when you are in Ghana, you're in the global south, your access to the powers of the world is limited because you need to go through your governments. You also need to go through other international NGOs to be able to reach out to them. Southern NGOs do not have standing with the EU, neither do they have standing with the US government or any international body. But our colleagues and partners in Europe, in America, have connections and direct linkages to them. Antonie mentioned to you that there are a lot of NGOs coming up or Southern voices coming up within Voice Network. For me, it's really, really exciting. I remember when my first Voice Network meeting I participated, it was just myself and another Ghanaian who were there. And of course, one of the conversations that we've been having, I was part of that conversation. How do we make sure that we have a lot more Southern voices? Because people are aware that there is a lot of change that we need internally within Ghana, but Northern NGOs don't have the standing to be able to, or the legitimacy to be able to make those cases. So it's a demand side change that we need, it's a supply side change that we need. And it's not a question of who is leading. For me, it's a question of what are the issues that we're trying to, and where do we want to get to. And so that is where I will put it. There is strong alliance between Southern and global NGOs. What I don't, then again, when you look at some theoretical theories of the world systems theory, the government of Ghana is much more aligned with the government of the EU or the government of the European countries than it is more aligned to its people. How do we break that? Through partnerships with international NGOs, international groups like Voice, Mighty Earth, and research bodies like that. That is how from the global south and the global north, we can change things both at the north and both at the south. So it's not just led by internationals. No, there are lots of local people very interested in that conversation too.
Thank you so much, Sam. So we're going to entertain one last question. There's still many more questions from the audience. This has been a very vibrant discussion. So we're going to ask, what types of African relevant foods could be grown that make use of the technologies which are being used in the cocoa industry itself? Who would like to answer that question?
Okay, I can answer that question. What types of sort of cocoa? The question is basically asking, if cocoa producers want to diversify, what should they diversify into, so to speak? I think I agree with Sam that it would be better to diversify into food crops. By food crops now, I mean crops that can be sold domestically in the domestic market. It makes no sense that Cote d'Ivoire and Ghana, the two biggest producers of cocoa in the world, are at the same time importing products, food items like rice, beans. They import these from abroad. My view would be that it is better to diversify into crops that can be sold at the local and the regional markets. There's local markets to both within Cote d'Ivoire, within Ghana, or to the regional, say, West African markets. There's a huge market in Nigeria. I think there are about 220 million people in Nigeria. And Nigeria imports lots of its food. If cocoa farmers choose to diversify into, I don't know, say rice, or there are so many crops that they can diversify into. But diversification would have to follow regional pattern, by which I mean, in a given region, it might be wise to diversify into a particular crop because of access to, say, markets, or access to grinding facilities, or because of the particular land, the sort of soil content in that region. Why in another region you'd have something else. So it is difficult to say this is what they should diversify into. This is what Ivorians or Ghanaians should diversify into. They should diversify into what makes sense given the regional information that they have.
Thank you so much, Michael. This has just been a very vibrant conversation with our audience today, and there are many more questions being raised. However, I'm going to bring the question and answer period to a close at this time to give our panelists time to give their conclusory remarks, what they would like for all of us to take back home with ourselves based upon the important comments that they would like us to keep in mind. So at this time, I'd like to call upon Michael, if you could give your conclusory remarks.
Okay, my conclusion would be just to touch on how to, if you like, decolonize the cocoa industry in West Africa. I'll give two ways. So one would be processing. The reason why I think processing is the way out is because there's this ethical sourcing market. So fair trade, for example, why don't they source directly from local producers, local chocolate producers, instead of, so fair trade can decide to buy from a chocolate producer in Ghana that sources directly from cocoa farmers, and then they can easily trace where they are sourcing the particular input, instead of the current model that exists. Fair trade can decide to buy from African chocolate manufacturers. I'm just giving that example. That's one way of decolonizing. That's processing locally. The other way of decolonizing is to diversify away from, and I agree with Sam here, to diversify away from cocoa. Cocoa farmers should start producing something else. Since there is very little demand for cocoa at the local and the regional level, they should diversify into products that they can sell at the local and the regional market so that they have control over who they're selling to, when they sell, and so on and so forth. So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Sam, would you like to give us your conclusory comments?
Yes. So for me, the first thing that I would see that I think would change the balance of power is farmers need to be aware. We need to, when I say we, I'm talking about civil society, research groups, people that are interested. We need to create more awareness for the farmer to understand what he is or he or she is part of. Usually farmer thinks that his business ends with selling his cocoa beans, but obviously if he understands that he is just a tiny cog in this whole wheel because people need his or her cocoa beans to do other things, I think that will change how he thinks a little bit. That will change how he negotiates with traders. That's how it's going to change. That will change how he relates with the government. And there are very good examples, like Isifu just raised a question on the panel. He's a cocoa farmer who is well educated and who understands the power imbalance and is asking difficult questions to Cocoa Board and other international NGOs. So that is where I think it needs to start from. Also, we need a lot more governance reform. Within Ghana, I can say with a lot of confidence that Cocoa Board is an institution in itself. It's an almighty institution, and we need to change it. We need greater transparency. We need greater accountability. We need greater citizen participation. I mean, farmers' participation in policy decision at that level. Antonie made that point that we need to ask ourselves, why do we want to grow cocoa? Why are we still growing cocoa? And for me, that is a fundamental question that within Ghana, within producers, they need to be able to address that question. So that if the solution lies in, hey, let's produce something else that we can get greater value from the land, because we shouldn't see it only as an agricultural question. It's a development question. It's a vision. What do farmers, the country as a whole, how do we want to see, what role do we think cocoa should play? And then we can go from there. But for other listeners who eat chocolate, for me, I always advise you to buy ethical chocolate. And the easiest way to know that is use the chocolate scorecard. So go to the chocolate scorecard. It tells you which companies are ethical. And for me, without doing advert for that organization or that process, buy only companies which are scoring a lot of greens. And then so that you can reward companies which are putting in a lot of effort to be the best in the industry. It is only by rewarding the best performing companies that other companies can also follow new and more good practices in the sector. So that's all my concluding remark for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. And at this time, Antonie, could you please give your conclusory remarks?
I will. And I'm not going to speak about what we can do to decolonize cocoa in West Africa. I want to spend some time about what we in the global north can do to actually be actively engaged in anti-racist activities in our own lives, because I think that we need to be willing to challenge our own assumptions on everything. Why is the world structured the way it is? And is that a fair way of doing things? And what historical injustices are at the bottom of that? There's a guy I follow on Instagram that speaks a lot on anti-racism and how we can work on that. And this week he had a video where he said, you cannot be an anti-racist. It's not a state of being. It's an activity that you do, and you can actually be actively participating in actions that help fight racism, But at the same time, as a person, you can still, because none of us are perfect, right? At the same time, we can still be engaged in thought processes and activities that still perpetuate the current systemic injustices at the same time. We're not one thing at the same time, but we can remind ourselves that it's a continuous state of activity and action. It's not something that we can be passive at. It's not something that we've arrived. It's not a balance that once we found it, we're okay. There's a constant tension in this process, which means we always need to be thinking, how am I contributing to fighting the systemic injustices that we see at a global level? And I think that none of us can be content with the place where we are, because at a global level, the place where we are is nowhere near where it should be. And so I think that if there's anything we can do is look in the mirror and question ourselves and see, how can we be better at this? How can we do better at this in every step that we take? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Antonie. And we'd like to draw the webinar to a close by allowing Morgana to please give your closing remarks, after which I will end the webinar. So Morgana, please.
Thank you. Today we've heard about a number of issues concerning the case of cocoa, ranging from human rights to the rights of nature, of the poly crisis facing not only farmers in Ghana and the Ivory Coast, but all of us. It's overwhelming. Is there hope, or is it really too late? My conclusion is that it's never too late. One of the questions in the question answers was from Steve Kramer. He asks, what can we do to address this inequality? We as consumers of cocoa and chocolate can still make our voices heard. We can support the organisations working towards greater collaboration with local governments and local communities. With respect to the living conditions and humanitarian aid, we heard that there are efforts being made towards greater equality, equity, and restorative healing. New business models are being introduced where farmers are treated with respect and dignity. New products and alternatives to cocoa farming are being introduced. Women in particular are benefiting from these initiatives. We can also work in our own communities and raise the ethical issues of consuming chocolate. When we buy cocoa or chocolate, which brands are the top scorers for addressing deforestation and climate change? Which brands are low on the scorecard? Sam mentioned the scorecard, which also includes which banks are still facilitating investments heavily in cocoa and chocolate. Are the claims that chocolate is beneficial to us correct? What action can we take? There are still very many questions, as we've seen in this webinar. However, as we have heard, organisations like Mighty Earth from Sam, and also the Voice Network from Antonie, they can provide us with invaluable resources and information. So in conclusion, I would like to thank all our speakers for making us aware of the real price of a bar of chocolate or a mug of hot cocoa. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you so very much, Morgana. And yes, the legacy of colonialism is still very evident in many facets of life in the production of cocoa. And the economic imperatives of the colonial era extracted the country's vast resources to benefit the European powers and resulted in rampant exploitation of local lands and people. And we see how this exploitation continues today. And the cocoa farmers who receive pennies on the dollar for their crops, which are really driving huge profits for multinational companies from developed countries that control really the pricing and distribution. But the economic inequity is a tip of the iceberg of the exploitation of farmers' lands and lifestyles in the cocoa growing industry. And there are human rights violations, poor working conditions in the farming and crop processing of cocoa. There is indeed very dark secrets that many who enjoy chocolate in its very luxurious forms are unaware of. So it is important that we support cruelty-free sustainable brands that adhere to ethical practices in cultivation, production, and distribution? Some very powerful questions were asked today, and I'm sorry that we didn't have an opportunity to fully answer them, but they also provide food for thought. And we must be more aware and educated consumers as well. And while it is heartening to hear about efforts to assist cocoa farmers with premiums, new products, and community programs, there is clearly so much still to be done. And I would like to express my deepest appreciation to all of our panelists for sharing your powerful perspectives on how neocolonialism manifests in the cocoa trade and increasing our awareness. And the Anti-Racism Initiative of the G20 Interfaith Forum extends its deepest appreciation to not only our panelists, our wonderful co-moderator, Morgana Sythove, for your participation, as well as our audience members who have taken the time to tune in today. And we wish you all a very good evening until we meet again. Thank you so much, everyone, and we bid you adieu.